Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for the final virtual artist talk of this spring. We'll have more virtual programs coming up in the fall. My name is Hannah Katz. I'm the Grants and Education Manager here at Donné. I use she, her pronouns. Donné is the leading cultural nonprofit organization dedicated to serving emerging and established artists through the collaborative creation of contemporary art using the process of hand papermaking. Based in Brooklyn, our programming includes residencies, fellowships, and workspace opportunities for artists, workshops, and educational programming for all ages, and exhibitions and publications. In this webinar, you can turn on automated captions by clicking the closed captions button at the bottom. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions throughout the talk, and we'll come back to all your questions at the end. Finally, I'm honored to introduce today's speakers. Aimee Lee is an artist who makes paper, writes, and advocates for Korean papermaking practices. Designated as an Ohio Arts Council Heritage Fellow, she's a two-time Fulbright Scholar to Korea, where she learned about making hanji, its applications, and its tools, and has studied with various Korean national and provincial holders of intangible cultural heritage since 2009. Her research led to the first hanji studio in North America, an award-winning book, Hanji Unfurled, and an active studio practice that includes jisung, jumchi, paper textile, botanical paper, book art, and natural dyeing techniques. She has shared these techniques and stories across the world and from her private hanji studio east of Cleveland. Velma Bolyard is a mother, artist, and teacher. Living north of the Adirondacks, she forages for and cultivates fibers, dye, and paper-making plants. She makes paper threads, spins kami ito, weaves shifu, and most recently makes fish skin parchment and spins and cultivates wild silks for her artist books. A papermaker since 1977, her specialty is local plant papers and flax, which she colors with plants and earth pigments. Velma retired from teaching special education and now focuses on making paper, shifu, and artist books. She teaches papermaking and book arts at St. Lawrence University and has traveled in North America and Australia to teach workshops and master classes. And finally, Tatiana Ginsberg is Director of Artistic Projects and Master Collaborator at Donné. She studied papermaking and book arts at the University of Iowa Center for the Book and received her MFA from the University of California, Santa Barbara. In between, she spent 2 years in Japan researching naturally dyed papers under a Fulbright grant. Returning to the US, she taught papermaking, printmaking, book arts, and drawing in universities for more than a decade. As Director of Artistic Projects and Master Collaborator at Donné, she works with other artists to make new work in handmade paper. She also edits the series Papermaker's Tears, essays on the art and craft of paper for the Legacy Press. Her own work combines traditional and contemporary methods of papermaking and is exhibited nationally and internationally. So without further ado, I'd love to welcome Tatiana to talk about Papermaker's Tears.
Tatiana, you're still muted.
Thank you. I thought I was off. Thanks. I'm very excited to be here today with Velma and Aimee, and thank you, Hannah, for that nice introduction. As Hannah mentioned, I edit this series, Papermaker's Tears. Volume 1 is sold out, but Volume 2, that both of these guys wrote great essays in, is available, and I put a link in the chat. You can also go to the Legacy Press website. Kathy Baker is the proprietor and has put together an amazing series of books, not just this one, but many others on papermaking and related arts, including Aimee Lee's book that Hannah mentioned. So today, Aimee and Velma will be discussing their creative work and their research with handmade paper and the traditions they draw on. Based on their essays in Volume 2. The Aimee Lee's essay is actually a two-part essay, so you are hearing more about the second part that's in Volume 2 today. The idea for this series came from talking to other paper makers and hearing about things that they were interested in and wanting to know more. So I've been very pleased to edit these 2 volumes, and hopefully someone else will take up the torch from here moving forward. So today we're going to hear first from Velma about her work in paper and in shifu in particular, which she'll tell you all about right now.
All right, can everybody hear me? I hope so. Thanks, Tatiana and Hannah and Donné and Aimee for having me along for the ride. This is a brand new adventure for me. What you're seeing here is sort of like my brain. The fibers, I walk almost daily if I can, and several miles a day, and I gather things when I'm walking. And what you're seeing are different kinds of fibers, mostly a good deal of it's milkweed and dogbane. And the small weaving on the other side is a mixture of paper and milkweed. Next. And here, this is what I make shifu out of. So I like to put marks on the paper before I go through the process of making it into shifu. I started graphing the emerald ash borer, making rubbings of their little markings on pieces of firewood, and that's what you see on one side, and the other is one of the ferns that grows in my yard, and I just did this strange ink rubbing, and it turned into something wonderful. So those images, those marks that are very definitely rooted in place, are spun up eventually into a thread, and the thread is what I weave book pages and mostly book pages these days out of. Next. So this is kami-ito. Kami-ito is a spun handmade paper, or usually handmade paper in my case. And I like to spin on drop spindles, on traditional wheels, on whatever is there. And sometimes that's my thigh. Sometimes it's just between my two hands, and I'm just spinning a yarn. In the group of skeins on the one side of your picture, you'll see three skeins that are very traditional in or more traditional in the Japanese sense. So the Japanese art of kami-ito and shifu making is much finer than what I employ in my own practice. But I sort of needed to prove to myself that I could make really fine yarn, and I have several skeins of that. What I generally use, though, is the heavier yarns on the other side of the picture, the 5 skeins, some of which are dyed with indigo, and I'm not sure about the gold. It is probably one of the many plants that gives gold, or the golden colors, and then black walnut, and then the natural dye, the natural color of the paper. And on the other side, you see a bit of the handmade paper just coming off the tip of the spindle. In this case, the spindle is on a Swedish bobbin winder, which is a surprisingly useful tool for making kami-ito. And then below that, you see one sheet of lokta, and the lokta was formed like Japanese washi. So it's not formed on the traditional Nepalese molds. It's formed on the sugeta. And that's one full sheet of paper, just so you can get an idea of how big it is. That little spindleful is probably about 5 inches long. Next. So when I was driving in my car one day, I decided I needed to weave shifu. Instead of on a big loom, I needed to weave pages for books. I had in mind that I was going to be making artist books, and I didn't know where it was going to go, but I thought I can make pages, but they will have fringe or hems, and I don't want fringe or hems if I make them on a floor loom. So what would happen if I made them on a little loom that I created? And I call this my stump loom. It is actually a hunk of 4x4 hemlock. I just I just pounded some brads into this hunk of wood and started warping my first little shifu square. What I wanted was to eliminate any weird edges. I wanted the pages to be integral to themselves. I wanted the textile to be its own textile and not be something that was cut off or hemmed. And on the other picture, you can see a whole bunch of them. You can see that I experiment with all kinds of dyeing and ways of putting the paper, making the paper more interesting. Almost in the center, there's an indigo piece, and one side you see a really dark mahogany color, and that is xantheria, which is a resin that I acquired in Australia, and I have friends that send me it, and that's one of my favorite strange dyes that I like to use. Next. So I took some of my shifu to my friend Mark McMurray of Caliban Press, and he said, I can print on those. And I believe Aimee was with me when we went to his studio and he printed on some shifu for us. It did scratch his wood type and it scratched the metal type, which was a surprise to him. And he said we could not do that anymore. Next, please. So I'm also a paper maker and like making paper for books in the shape of the book. So I find naturally split rocks when I'm out walking and haul them home and try to make them into books. This book is made, I think the paper inside is a botanical mix. It probably has abaca, it looks like it to me. And then I just, each one of these is different. There are about 6 or 7 rock books. The largest one probably weighs 20 pounds. This one is a smaller one and you can hold it in your hands, although you probably couldn't open it and hold both slabs at the same time. Next. So having a background in textile design, I go into a fabric store and I go a little mad every time. And there used to be a wonderful fabric store in Brattleboro, Vermont called Delectable Mountain. And once I was there and I found this amazing triple woven silk. So it's 3 layers of silk. They're attached every ½ inch in a grid, but you can't see the attachments unless you really look for them. And I decided I would try eco printing or botanical contact printing on them. And the result of those experiments were 2 books called Detritus. And I used the slot and tab or slip and slide structure for each section that I made. And there are, I think I counted the stitches in one section one time, but I can't remember numbers very well. There are thousands of stitches in this book and in the other book that is no longer here. Next. Recently I've been making, so you're seeing the most, well, not the most recent, almost the most recent shifu books. I took these to Codex, the 2 codexes ago. And Consider came from my friend, a friend in the Northwest Coast who was saying, just consider what we're doing to this world, basically. Just consider the way you live. Think about it. So I made these 2 with fish skin binding, fish parchment, and the fish is haddock, and it's got a little poem. Each page has part of the poem sewn to it. And they just had to go out in the early spring and hang out with the crocuses one morning. Next. So this is a more recent book. I think it's about a year or two old. The one that we just looked at is maybe 3 years old. And this book is a book I love, and it's audible. I'm going to make a noise and you're going to hear it. So that's the sound of the bones. When I moved to the house I'm living in now, it was a pretty difficult time for me, and I was walking around out in my yard. I have about 3 acres, and I'm on a little river that's called Little River. And I found a dead red fox, and it was almost completely gone. Other scavengers had their fill, and there were bones hanging out. The skull was gone. Some of the spine, the backbones, I'm sorry, were there, and all of the leg bones. So I brought them in the house and just looked at them for a while. And I had been making flax paper and experimenting with pigmenting it with indigo. And this book happened. The pages and then the little the slipcase is actually a basket, and all of that is a Aimee fishing net yarn, and each one of those folios is a 4 salvage folio. Again, no knots, no hems. Um, all of these technical things are really important to me as a maker. I can dive deep and maybe kind of lose myself at times. But weaving these proved to be really challenging because this yarn likes to, well, as you can tell, it's very, very curly, very spiky, and sometimes they break a lot, and sometimes they're just as strong as the old fishing nets were that they came from. So this was an interesting book. I think there are 3 of these, but each one is slightly different. Next, please. This is what I've been working on more recently. You see, the first one I did was the golden one, and that is poplar wood with milk paint, and the pages are shifu. And then the second one was the indigo one, and that's indigo ink that I made. And I also indigoed, I coated the box that I found to put that book in. Somehow it fits just right. And then the one on top is a white milk paint. I find the milk paint really interesting because I can really manipulate the pigments in it and mess around with it and create layers and rub them off. And so each of these books is really, really soft to the touch, and they're really incredibly light. Next, please. And this is that golden one, and you see on top of it a Cecropia moth cocoon. And what I'm doing right now in my in my little world here is I am raising a bunch of giant silk moths, and this cocoon has had its moth emerge, and it was a beautiful, very large Cecropia. I found this cocoon on a shrub on my road that I've probably walked by at least 100 times. And one day, a couple months ago, I walked by and there it was. So, and it's now been emerged, and now I have Cecropia eggs to raise. So my current venture is trying to work with the local wild silk moth populations by raising some farmed different kinds of silk moths, and having them attract local population moths to come in and fertilize the eggs. So I have Polyphemus, Cecropia, and Luna eggs that I hope will become moths. And by doing this, I can also augment the local population. These guys get eaten very easily and quickly by birds. So it's nice to maybe make the population just a little bit, bump it up just a little bit. And next, I think that's the last one.
I think that's the last one. I think that possibly we
I think if you
skipped.
go back to page 8,
Yeah,
then
I think that I was going to say
Yeah.
that. Yeah, we missed this one. Sorry,
Oh,
Velma.
okay.
there was one before that. I think there were a couple. I thought there was.
Oh, it jumped a lot.
Oh, sorry. No. Go.
Just that
I
one.
thought that there was yeah, I thought that one and then another, but maybe
Oh,
that
I'm
was
sorry. We edited a little bit since we
Oh.
sent it to you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no problem. So this is the other part of what I do in my kitchen besides raise silk moths and weave on little stumps as I make botanical contact prints. So on the one side, you see a bunch of my flax paper that I've printed. It's also called eco printing. So if you're familiar with the whole eco printing craze, which is kind of a craze and it's very exciting to do. An eco print is essentially a map of the day and the plants that you use, also of the waters and the fibers you use. So it's really an interesting way to record a moment in time or a series of moments. So that's just a sampling of some of the patterns I get. And then Mark McMurray from Caliban Press and said, you need to you need to edition a book that has more than 2 or 3 copies. So together we printed November a map, and it is on a half sheet of Arches text wove. I eco printed them, and then we took them to the press and we printed on both sides, and and then we cut it into a map fold. So also called a meander book. And there it is. So that was done probably maybe 6 years ago. I'm not sure about that. But the flax paper that you see on the other side is a little more recent, and I'm pretty happy with some of the results. I can't even tell you all the plants that are represented there, but if I worked on it for a while, I might be able to. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
So I think that we can turn it over to Amy's presentation.
Okay. Let me just. Okay, so these are tools that are I'm so glad, actually. I just want to say thank you to everyone, to you, Donné. Thank you, Tatiana, for convincing Velma to join us, because it's a real treat for people who get to see. I mean, of course, the work is all much better in person, but to be able to hear about her work, I think, is so valuable, and we don't get to see that or hear about it enough. So I'm actually going to just talk about my research, which is a huge part. It's a huge layer of my work, but it's not the artwork, though I guess if you talk about writing, it is. These are tools that were bequeathed to, or essentially acquired by Serge Pirard, who is in Belgium, and he is the successor to Ron MacDonald. And he basically bought his entire shop. And so I want to talk about the 2 people I wrote about in the second of the 2-part essay in the second volume, Papermaker's Tears. And so Ronald MacDonald is unfortunately not with us anymore, but was an incredible hand mold maker, but also dandy roll maker, like just all the equipment that you used to need. And that's going from that kind of cusp of moving from hand paper making to machine paper making when they both existed at the same time. And he was the last person in England that was that was practicing this legacy. And so he was born in 1933. He lived through the war. He was extremely active, and even as he got older, was always outdoors doing sports, surfing with his wife. This is the occasion of his first wedding to his first wife with his father. And his father was also in the business of making molds and making equipment for paper making. And so he inherited that, I think, when he was a teenager, he started doing this work, working under his father and learning from all the people in the shop. And so we have the most information about the hand paper making molds. And he also left, this is again a setup at Serge's studio in Belgium, where with all of Ron's old things, including these beautiful watermarks that were all wire and hand bent, which then Ron would sew on by hand. And this is one of the many ways that you can make watermarks. And I am not covering watermarks and watermark makers in my book, but that's something that, again, there are so many things in hand paper making to research, and people are doing this research, and I hope people pick up more of the watermark research, because it is something that the paper makers really want as well. A lot of the paper makers I met were like, are you talking to the people who make the watermarks? Because I need more watermarks, or I need them made in at a very high level. And so that's also being lost. And this is an example of mold that has a screen on it that will give you a lot of the both the light and shade watermarks and the line watermarks. And that's a piece of paper that you would get from that mold. And then this is a set of his molds, and these are smaller ones, but eventually he got to, his life goal was 10,000, not just hand molds, but all the equipment. And he got very close. He got over 9,000, and they're all stamped and numbered. And Serge, who has he continues now the numbering system, picking up from where Ron ended. And these are a bunch of them in use, being stored at Pascal Jean-Jean's studio, who's a French paper maker working out of Belgium, who had a very close relationship with Ron. And it was very hard for him as well to lose his mold maker. And here's Ron with his loom, and this is after had been moved many times. So this loom has been in use for hundreds of years, and it's extremely large and extremely heavy. So just the fact that he had moved it so many times over the course of the business taking a lot of ups and downs, and I won't go into all of it, you can just read the essay, but he had been looking at the end of his life. He had built a shed behind his house in his garden to house the loom, so that he could keep making hand made molds, but he was looking for somebody to take it on. And eventually Serge did so, and that was a huge task that he and his friend, and that they drove it all back from England to Belgium and installed it. And this loom is built to weave the facings for that's the metal part that goes on top of the mold frame. And so there's a whole process of just getting it set up to weave, just like with a loom for weaving fabric. And so, you can see Sarah just kind of inside it, getting things ready. But then the way that it kind of functions when you start going is with this foot pedal. And Ron also really, I said, loved being outdoors, and he loved working outdoors, and found that sunlight was the best light source for him to do all this fine work and this sewing. And so he was often outside, and his friends and colleagues who knew him loved to sit outside with him as he worked. And he made it look very, very easy, like, oh, anyone could do this. But it was something that almost no one could do that he trained. They just couldn't keep up. Or they just couldn't do it to the kind of the level and that specificity, the detail. And then he, again, I was saying, met Serge. And so I wanted to show this kind of, not exactly a straight line lineage. This is a straight line lineage. And so is this. So Claudine Latron was, or she is a mold maker in France. She's actually in the process of kind of retiring and passing it on to someone else. So she's working with someone at a museum and there's a young man who's interested in training with her. And you can see she built her own loom. And then she did that with the first person she learned mold making from in a papermaking workshop, who was a Frenchman, who told her about Ron. And then she essentially wrote him a letter and asked if she could visit. And he said yes. And so she went to him twice to learn. And she made a lot of molds as well before she moved away. She was in Lille, which is further north and closer to the border with Belgium, but now is in the south of France. And she actually, for her loom, looked at Timothy Moore's loom. So his loom is in the picture, kind of behind him. And he also was trying to figure out, he had studied the video. There's a great DVD about Ron MacDonald that you can purchase. And he had studied that. He studied everything that has to do with anything related to molds, and was the preeminent hand mold maker in America. And he's also retired, but has made molds for Dieu, has made molds for many, many, many people. This is just like Ron's molds. Tim's molds are ones that no one will ever, they will never part with. This is something you keep until you die. And then Bob Walp, who is in the Adirondacks. Tim is in Michigan. Bob is a paper maker, a bookmaker, a printer, and he's also extremely skilled. He's skilled as a carpenter and a house builder. And he came out of the MFA program at Alabama. And in the process of his learning about paper making, this was before he did his master's degree, he was making his own tools because and this is a book press that he made for his bachelor's degree thesis, and he still uses it to this day. But then he also got into making molds, and he studied the articles that Tim wrote for hand paper making about making molds. And so there is this kind of these lines that go out. As you can see, a lot of the people are of a certain generation. And so the second person in the essay, besides Ron, was Howie Clark. And he and his wife Catherine started Twin Rocker in the 1970s in America as kind of I don't know if, well, maybe they did know what they were doing, but essentially starting the revival of hand paper making in America, and really looking at it as an art form unto itself. And that's a lot of what you can see, a lot of that lineage through what Dieu is doing today. And so Howie was by trade an engineer, just this brilliant mind, but Kathy was an artist and a printmaker, and she had taken classes with one of the very first people and this was in the US, but in Michigan, learning to make paper by hand to print onto. And so together they combined forces over time. I mean, this, of course, this is, again, a story that you can read about in the essay. Nick Bassbanes also has a great chapter about them in his book on paper. And essentially how he's so curious about making things and creating really beautiful machines that function very well for the thing that they need to do. And so he could have been in Detroit working for the car industry easily. And that's kind of his family's background, tractors. And but he ended up becoming like the person making all the equipment for Twin Rocker, which was so important for the rest of the field because they had all these apprentices come through. And so you can see kind of specs of, a handmade Hollander, and then images of him with the first beater that was just wood, and then the next huge stainless steel one. You can see him here with one of Susan Totten, who was one of the apprentices who came through, and she actually it was her boyfriend who first was working with Howie, but he was not as good of a fit, and ended up, it turned out she was more useful, like she would be just doing chores around the shop, and then he would show her how to do things, and really built her confidence in being able to do things she had never thought of, like welding. And she ended up making a lot of the presses, so not just beaters that he was making, but things like presses. And this is the first time I think, probably in my hand paper making career, when I was younger, seen one of his presses, and this was at Haystack. But if you look at the plate, it actually is, it has her name on it, because he's so, he doesn't have a huge ego. And so he was like, these are her presses. She built them. And they're also numbered, but this is one of the 100-ton press that he made for Twin Rocker now. And like engineering wise, he had to figure out how to make the press, but then realize it doesn't fit the building. And so now we have to cut a hole in the ceiling. So, all these kinds of problem solving things are a part of like every day of his life. And so you can see in the beater room for Twin Rocker, there's the 2 white beaters on the left side that are his model that he specifically made in this way so that you cannot get your hand caught into the roll. You would have to stick your whole arm and wrap it around and hug the machine if you wanted to get anywhere close to the roll, which is really important. And then on the right, you can see the giant stainless beater, which at the time that I was visiting him in I want to say 2019-ish or 2018, he had taken out the roll and was working on it. And so he had also just recently had a reunion of their apprentices, and you can see Timothy Barrett's in the photo, and he's showing them the roll, and what he had to do is you have to in between the blades the knives are woods. There's wood, and that over time will decay, and you have to pull them all out and replace them. So you can see a little more clearly in this photo what he's going to have to do to fill up the entire roll with knives again, and then get it back into the machine. And so this is him. Todd Mathis took this picture. He took all of the black and white photos. And this is later when I was able to meet him. And then again, that legacy lives on. Like, this is Bernie Vinzani's beaters up in Maine, just meticulously kept. And Bernie was one of his apprentices and stayed for a while. Lee Scott MacDonald was an early apprentice, and he makes his own. This is part of one of his Oracle beaters, and he's out in Boston. And he also was making molds. He had a whole supply business supplying paper makers. And then David Reyna, who is in New York and is retiring, but builds beaters, dry boxes, vacuum tables. Again, large equipment for paper makers. He built, when I was at the Morgan Conservatory in Cleveland, he built us a custom naginata. And then Mark Lander, who is out in New Zealand. And these are kind of not what you think of when you think of Mark's machines, because you think of the critters with the collapsible tubs, which was his kind of ingenious way of being able to travel, like put a beater in a suitcase and travel. But I got to visit him and see his larger machines, and then see him making paper, and him again just figuring out how to adapt machines, and then eventually build his own, and then build them for other people. And all of this interest in people who make tools and equipment came from my research in Hanji. And so the first time I went to Korea, I met this couple, and they were making the screens that make Hanji, and they were the only ones left making it. And this is in 2009. Seo Jong-im is the wife, and Yoo Bae-kun was the husband, and he was the designated provincial, like Jeolla province, intangible cultural property holder of making Hanji screens. And this is when I saw them later in 2014. And then in 2021, I visited again. And they had since moved to another house, and she works in this tiny space. And essentially at that point, she was doing all the work, because he was at this point really not all in his mind anymore, in a way where he could work. And sadly, earlier this year in January, he passed away. And so for me, it was just this fear of this exact thing happening when they pass, and if they have not trained successors. And so fortunately, his wife is still, or his widow is still working, and so this is Lisa, one of my students who went to visit her this year, and then Esther and Veronica, who went to visit her just a few weeks ago. And so with the hopes that you know, like these young students who are in their 30s will take on not just the paper making and the art making part of it, but do more research and practice into the actual tool making part, because we have nothing if we cannot make paper if we don't have tools. So I'm going to stop sharing and
Thank you both for that. That was really great to get a little window into some of the work that you've both been doing. And of course, these are just brief introductions. I know each of you has many more things that you do and make and can share. But what sort of struck me while I was listening to you was the sort of need to be both really taking in the craft and the history and, you know, building off of the techniques that have been refined for hundreds of years, and at the same time be able to kind of innovate or make things that work in different scenarios. You know, from Velma's stump loom, something that's like very direct and simple, to, you know, something like Howie's beaters that are, you know, made safer. It's kind of interesting to see those intersections of different things. And we titled this talk today, Hidden Labor in Papermaking, because I do think there's so much that people don't know essentially about what goes into what's behind the scenes that you both in your practices been very keenly aware of trying to keep alive and to pass on. But one thing you didn't talk about, Aimee, that I sort of thought was interesting as I thought about it is that you both, I know, are friends and have known each other a long time and talk about a lot of ways that you make things, but you both weave paper. And I think weaving paper is maybe something that's unusual for a lot of people. You know, many people don't, it's not the first thing people think of doing with paper is weaving with it. So maybe you could each say a little something about how you got into weaving paper, or how it even kind of came into your consciousness. I know, Velma, you talk a little bit about that in your essay, and I thought it would just be fun to hear a little of that from both of you.
So I'll start. Is that okay, Aimee? So I fell in love with this thing called shifu when I opened a magazine sitting on my studio floor in my old farmhouse in I think it might have been 85, written by Dorothy Miller, and it was amazing. There was this beautiful textile. It was Japanese. It was paper. It was called shifu, and that's all I knew. And then from then on, it was many years of trying to figure out what this shifu thing was. And then a long time later, after I was making my own shifu, I found this young woman's artwork on the internet, and I immediately emailed her, and she happened to be on her way to Korea or in Korea to study traditional Hanji, and that's Aimee. And I just sort of bowled my way into her life and said, wow, your work just speaks to me. It was like our work was talking to each other. That's how it felt to me anyway. I don't know how it felt for Aimee. So that's how we became friends. And I think it's almost 20 years now, or close to it anyway.
yeah, it's getting there.
Oh,
Yeah.
we're getting old. I'm getting old.
No, we're both getting old, or I'm for sure getting old. But yeah, I mean, I think it's actually a very common impulse. I mean, starting in childhood to weave paper, not in like a loom way, but in a, you know, the construction paper, it's like everyone learns to do it, and like why we ever stop is a mystery to me. But and Velma was the one who I didn't know anything about fiber arts, whereas Velma is trained as a weaver first before she got into paper making. So it's a really different trajectory. And she was always helping to guide me, but she found me at a time when I had already just been kind of very roughly, like, not even spinning, but kind of rolling paper on my thigh to try to make some kind of yarn, before I understood that you have to have both ends fastened to be able to spin it. And so she was the one, when I went to Korea and started doing chisung, which is paper basketry, she was the one who said, Aimee, you were making baskets. And I said, no, I'm not. And I'm just weaving paper. And she was like, no, that is making baskets. And so it took a really long time and meeting a lot of basket makers to understand that she was correct. And so, and everything I've learned about weaving paper in the way that Velma does, I've learned from her. And that's what I share with my students as well. And so, yeah, I think there's just this natural affinity and obviously an affinity that other people have to it because of all the books that I've lost or had stolen. One of her early books that she gave to me that was all shifu pages and hand-dyed vellum with a stone tied in, that was the one that was stolen from a teaching situation, which I didn't know until much later and still am very upset about, but yeah.
Thank you. That's great to sort of have that background. We have a couple of questions that I'll throw out there that are in the Q&A, and if anybody has additional ones, please feel free to put that into the question and answer chat box at the bottom of your screen. The first one is, Velma, we have a request for you to shake your bone book again because we couldn't hear it well. The request, in fact, comes from Hannah, your daughter.
You have to hold it like close to the computer.
Yeah,
basically.
so
Okay, so here it is. No, I don't know where the speaker is or the microphone.
I think Zoom might actually edit out the sound as background noise. The computer might be too smart and it's becoming stupid.
Well, I am shaking it, so there you go.
well, maybe you can describe to us the sound that it makes.
I will, because I call it a clatter. It sounds to me like if you have a bunch of bones and you toss them around, they clatter, they make a different sound that's not wooden and it's not glass, and yet they're similar, but they're different. But in the poem that I wrote, that's in the book, and it says something about the bones clattering, and that I'm not a poet, but sometimes when I'm making a book, a poem comes, and it was the perfect word to describe what the book was about. So sometimes that happens. I don't know how.
That's kind of an example of what I love about Velma and her work is she thinks that everyone has the experience of like, shaking a bunch of bones in their hands. And I think, but that's really, it speaks to, she talked in the very beginning about going for these walks. A lot of people don't do that. I mean, I don't do that. And she has always been she just sees so much. She sees all kinds of stuff that I completely miss. And she's so drawn to things in a way where there's no kind of fear or disgust. It's just kind of like, oh, this is a dead bird. And also with a practical, growing up and living in a rural area, knowing what is safe to do and not safe to do, what is legal and what is not, and knowing you can handle these things or take pictures of these things and then, wash your hands or whatever and not get sick. And whereas I know people in my life where I can't understand, they won't even eat meat off the bone. Like if there's bones in their food, they will run away. And so I think that's something that's lost is Velma's this deep connection that she has with the rest of the world that I think, only comes from, being able to really truly, she is truly rooted in her place.
Wow.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
Thank you. It sometimes seems a little strange that other people don't, when I describe something, they look at me in puzzlement and I'll say, oh, you don't understand. Okay, let me describe that better, or let me help you understand why am I crazy about these moths right now? Well, I'm going to be spinning their cocoons soon, and that makes me, I don't know what I'll do with it, probably a book, but we'll see. But Aimee totally appreciates it and gets it, and and I'll say, it's okay to touch that. And she'll say, no.
Exactly, and that's part of your bond.
Yeah.
We have another question, which is, what is the background piece on Aimee's screen? So maybe, Aimee,
This is just, it's just paper. They're all, this is like one
Just
piece that's left over from my master's, my MFA thesis in Chicago from many, many years ago. So, from 2006, actually. So it's mostly abacus, some cotton, some, the cotton was all probably recycled from rags, and they're all paper bricks. So they're molded around, I have 3-part molds for each of them. And then and then they would, be beaten long enough to shrink. And then I would have to make the paper, wrap each one. I had about 80 molds going at a time, and then let it dry, and then pull out the molds, and then repeat. And so that eventually I had over 2,000 bricks, and then made a 14-foot tower. And then I only kept a few, like this piece and like a piece this small, and then like a slightly bigger piece, and the rest of it, after traveling it to the Fuller Craft Museum for a show, I realized this is such a nightmare to install that I threw it all away, because that's the only way you can get people to stop asking you to show your work if it doesn't exist anymore.
well, I'm glad you kept a piece of it, actually, just so that you have a record of that labor and that experience of your own personal history and everything. But yeah, it is a problem how to store some of these things and how to install them. Aimee, we have another question about if you could talk a little bit more about where you hope that your research on tools and legacies will go. I
Wow.
know from talking to you that you've been working on this for a very long
I
time
forgot
in
to-
different ways, right?
Yeah, so I have to thank Tatiana for pushing me to even get these essays done, because the whole point, this was back in 2016, I'd gotten a grant from the Center for Craft, and that was back when they were like, had a different name. That's how long ago it is. But they gave me a research grant to basically go around and find people who make tools and equipment for hand paper making and write a book about it. And I got the grant, and then promptly was terrified, because I thought, well, that was a fun idea, but I don't want to actually do it. But I mean, I did want to do it. It was just going to be a lot of work, and it has been a lot of work, wonderful work, but also hard, because you can see I make art, but I also do this research, and you can't do them simultaneously. So if I want to write every day, that means my best morning time is spent writing and not making things at the bench or at the bat. But yes, it will eventually be a book. My publisher has been infinitely patient. I think I've missed many deadlines over many years to get her manuscript. And I shouldn't even say it now, but I'm telling her that I'm getting it to her at the end of this year. I have a few more left to write. I just wrapped up writing about Mark Lander. The tricky part when you're writing about people who are still alive, which is almost everyone, is that, I want to do it correctly. I'm not a journalist. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not an ethnographer. I'm just an artist and a paper maker who really wants to document the work of these people and honor what they're doing, but also be honest about what's going on. And, it's maybe not always good for business. So the tricky part in this is not that I write it and then send it to Kathy. It's that I write it and then send it to each person and then harass them for years. Sometimes there are some people who are on my list for years for edits to make sure that I've gotten things at least closer to acceptable. So it's going to be a book, and hopefully sooner than later. But all the people that you saw will be in the book.
Great, excellent. We have another question for Velma. Do you only spin your own handmade paper, or do you have favorite papers that are not your paper, or other papers that you've used at some point that you could recommend?
I I spin very little of my own paper. Mostly my own paper is I'm working with flax, but I also work with local botanicals. It would be nice if I could say that I spun only my own handmade paper. However, I to get the strength and the finest quality, I tend to use Japanese papers, and hanji, Korean papers, and also some Lokta papers are also very good. You know, if you're making your paper and you're spinning it and there's so much labor involved in all of that. To buy the paper means that I can do more artwork with it. So even though I am a paper maker and I love to make paper and I make it a lot, and I have I have access to a studio at St. Lawrence, and I have a beater waiting in my basement to be made into a studio. I I just don't have enough time. Even now that I'm retired, I don't have enough time to do it all. I'd like to be able to, but I just can't. So recommendations, I would recommend the experts. And so the Japanese paper place in Toronto, and then Washi Arts in Blaine, Washington, both have incredible collections of heritage Japanese papers, and the people that run both of those places can help you. I know there are other amazing importers. Those are the two I know the best. I've also used Hiromi and, oh goodness, Lauren, I can't remember what her
Roman.
And I've worked with some papers from them as well. Also, Steph Rue sent me a bunch of amazing hanji that I used for the hanji edition. I think it was #2 that I worked on, and it was it was wonderful paper to work with. So I'm pretty eclectic. If I can spin it, I'm happy. So
That's great. We have time for maybe one more question. Maybe we'll just end with this. We have a question, how can the papermaking community support the preservation of this knowledge so that it continues to kind of be a living legacy, both in the tool making maybe and in the practice? Do you have any thoughts about that, either of you? It's a big question.
I think, well, I'm just going to just real quick. I know Aimee will have a much more, well, she'll have a richer answer than I do, but our students, I think Aimee and I both have had students, both university students and then adult learners that have studied with us, and it's their responsibility to take that and run with it and to pass it on. Aimee,
I mean, I love that. It makes me feel like I should give my students more responsibility than I'm giving them, but I think I'm a little more like, oh, do whatever you want. But I do let them know that I actually think, two of the last two in the last slide studied hanji with me, hanji making, but were most drawn to this issue of the bamboo screen. And so that's what they just did. They did a research trip together to Vietnam and to Korea, and met screen makers in both places who make screens specifically for paper making. So I think in terms of the paper making community, though, it's a tricky thing, because it's like, that a community is very kind of amorphous, and it's also made up of many other smaller communities. And I think, like Mina Takahashi has been very open at hand paper making, and having, like, I published another essay about Alejandro Geiler in Argentina, who makes molds in the magazine. I think the tricky thing will probably be, now that everything is so digital, like, where do those get stored in a way that's safe and accessible? I know, like University of Iowa has a bunch of things, like Tim Barrett has his own kind of archive there, but how can people who don't, can't physically get to Iowa access it? And I'm having that issue myself too, where, I have things like living somewhere servers that are creating too much heat in the world, like holding on to all of these digital photos and videos, but then there's even more documentation too, like all my notes. Like I don't know yet exactly how it gets passed down, but it's like the same question in any country though. Like the US has a little bit of this kind of honoring people who do this work and giving them some status or money, but it's not in a regular kind of way. So until you get enough support, like support people who are doing the work so that they can do the work instead of do other things to make money while they do this as their kind of passion project. So yeah.
Thank you.
Ending with really big questions. So now we've hit 2 o'clock. I feel like we could talk to Aimee and Velma for a whole nother hour, but we did not schedule that. So I want to extend just huge thanks from Donné to Aimee and Velma and so Tatiana for participating in this talk and giving us a taste of your artwork and your research, and opening up, I think, so many questions for all of us about how this is preserved and the work that goes into these projects. And I also want to thank everyone who joined us live. We so appreciate you sharing your Wednesday afternoon with us.